Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard, where we are going through the famous Richard Reti's book, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each game and going through his analysis one at a time. The first person in the book is Adolf Anderssen, and we've looked at his past two games, and we're now looking at his third game, and this is the final game of Anderssen's in the book. The previous two games were played in 1862 and 1863, whilst this one was played in 1873. And Reti comments about how in this time period, Anderssen even was playing a bit more positionally, although Anderssen's combinational power does remain very clear. And Reti notes that the combination of Reti's positional play and his tactical combinational ability leads to games with quite a unique character. And so in this game, we have Louis Paulsen with the black pieces facing Adolf Anderssen with the white pieces. Anderssen starts off e4, e5, knight f3, and then d6, and Paulsen plays the Philidor defense. And already we have quite a bit of analysis of Reti, and he's quite critical of this opening. He says that knight c6 is the better option because it offers black the option of still playing d5 and therefore fighting for the center. He says that he believes d6 is almost a surrender of the center because black's going to be less able to play d5 in the future. He also comments about how older players have criticized the move d6 because it blocks in this dark square bishop, but he says that he believes that this is of relatively minor importance. So Anderssen plays d4, which is the main line still today. E takes d4, and again this is the most common move played by masters. And then Anderssen responds with queen takes d4. And this variation isn't really seen that much today, but the idea of it is that when black plays their knight to c6, white aims to pin this knight with a light square bishop, and then exchange its bishop for the knight on c6. So white will give up the bishop pair, but in return they'll be able to have their queen in the center of the board where it can't really be easily attacked. If black wants to try and move this queen away, they're going to have to spend a couple of moves doing it, or weaken their position quite a bit with a move like c5. So Paulsen, as we discussed, continues with knight c6, bishop b5, pinning the knight, bishop d7, unpinning, and then Anderssen exchanges off the knight. And now we have bishop g5, knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, and castling long. Now this position is still seen today, and it's quite frequently, but it's normally arrived at via the Ruy Lopez, the Steinitz variation of the Ruy Lopez, which would continue as e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and then d6 going into the old Steinitz defense. Then after d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop d7, bishop takes, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, and castling long, we have the same position as before. Now, most opening books would argue that white is probably in a better position here, and they've achieved most of their opening goals, and indeed, looking at master games, white does have quite a higher win rate than black in this position. So Paulsen continues with castling short, then rook h to e1 and rook e8. And now Reti offers a nice bit of analysis on this position. He says that white has completed his development, and black has also completed their development, but only as far as black's cramped position will permit. The pawn position in the center, with white's pawn on e4 and black's pawn on d6, offers white a definite advantage. White has a space advantage and more control in the center. And one result of this advantage is that white was able to place their rooks on e1 and d1, whilst black doesn't really have a effective spot for this a8 rook. And now Anderssen continues with king b1. And Reti comments on this move, saying that Anderssen is now content with his victory in the fight for the superiority in the centre, and therefore Anderssen can afford to make a weighty move that contributes to the safety of his position. He says that in cases like this, where there is a lasting positional advantage, such safety moves are very often to the point. Paulsen continues with bishop d7, and he says that black is hoping to maneuver his bishop to e6. But in doing this little maneuver, he gives Anderssen the opportunity of increasing his positional advantage. Anderssen now is able to pull off a little combination that exchanges his current positional advantage for a greater, even more lasting positional advantage. And it all starts with this bishop takes f6. So bishop takes back, otherwise that would just be disastrous. Bishop takes f6 and then e5. It's worth noting the pawn on d6 is pinned because this will just lose a piece. So after e5, Paulsen retreats the knight to e7. Paulsen retreats the bishop to e7. It's worth noting as well that the bishop can't take on e5 either, because after knight takes e5, if the rooks exchanges as well, we see again this pin comes into effect, and white is simply up a piece. So Paulsen plays bishop e7, getting out of the way of this pawn. And then knight d5, and again white is threatening to win a pawn. If black was to just pass their move, so we have knight takes c7, queen takes c7, e takes d6, queen takes d6, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and then the queens exchange, followed by the rook taking his pawn on d6. Now this is the computer line, but it's pretty clear that something along these lines would have occurred in the game. And it's worth noting there is no risk of back rank mate because the knight covers the e1 square, and black also can't get their rook to e2 because it would hang the bishop. So in this position, therefore, Paulsen plays bishop f8, undeveloping his bishop, but hoping to try and hang on to his pawn. And now Anderssen exchanges on d6, and c takes d6, and again Paulsen can't take back with the bishop because it would still lose a pawn. We will see knight takes c7, queen takes c7, and after the rooks exchange, queen takes d6 and rook takes d6. And again, white is a pawn up, the bishop is under attack, and the knight defends the e1 square. So instead, the Paulsen takes on d6 with the c pawn, and here we see the end of Reti's combinations. He's achieved the positional advantage that he wanted, that started with the 12th move of bishop takes f6. In this position, bishop takes f6, he would have calculated all the way up until this point. He probably even calculated further. And here Reti writes quite a bit about this. He says that Anderssen has basically forced black into having an isolated pawn on d6, and how this isolated pawn is a greater positional advantage for which Anderssen sacrificed his previous advantage, the previous advantage being the pawn on e4 and d6. And Reti goes into quite a bit of analysis about this position with the isolated queen's pawn. He says that every chess player seems to know that an isolated pawn can be a disadvantage, but they often don't really know why it's a disadvantage and how the opposing player can use it to their advantage. He says that a lot of players may believe the isolated pawn is fairly weak and easy to capture, but he says that this isn't actually normally the case, because if the position is otherwise equal, there's no reason why the opponent should be able to. There's no reason why you can't defend a pawn with as many pieces attacking it if the position is equal. Therefore, the primary disadvantage of the isolated pawn isn't the pawn itself, but rather the square in front of the pawn. Here would be the d5 square. This square is currently fully under control of Anderssen with the white pieces, and Anderssen's goal now will be to establish a piece on this square with near permanent effect. And he'll be able to do this quite well because there's no neighbouring pawns to kick off this knight. And also, the d6 pawn itself obstructs any rooks or queens attacking. And he says that the most effective piece for blockading an isolated pawn is often a knight. The other pieces are long range and are often almost just as effective from a long distance. Whereas a knight's effectiveness, if it takes up a position in front of a passed pawn towards the enemy's base, is far greater. And so, after this analysis of the position, Reti says it's quite clear as to what Black's aim is. Black wants to try and exchange this knight on d5 for this light square bishop on d6, whilst Anderssen wants to stop White from doing this and keep his knight on d5. And he says that the way Anderssen stops Black from being able to exchange this bishop is quite instructive and shows Anderssen's positional and combinational ability. So Anderssen takes an e8, bishop takes e8, and now knight d2. Paulsen responds with bishop c6, hoping to exchange the knight off, and now knight e4. And now Black can't take the knight on d5 without losing this d6 pawn. So Paulsen responds with f5, kicking the knight away, and then knight to c3. And with this move, White's now secured a dominating position. This knight on d5 is going to be there for the rest of the game, or at least as long as Anderssen wants it to be. So Paulsen responds, queen d7, and now a3. And his a3 move again, Reti comments on it. He says that similar to the king b1 move, we see Anderssen has secured his positional advantage and simply makes a waiting move to improve his king's position. He's no longer at risk of any back rank mates. Paulsen responds with queen f7 and now h3. And again, Reti offers quite a nice little bit of analysis here. He says about how a new phase of the game is starting. The assault of the pawns on the king's side. White's essentially going to start a pawn storm against the black king. Reti says about how similar tactics are often observed in coffee shops by amateur players, but they're often not always positionally justified. The attack on the pawns, attacking on the flank, can only really occur if the centre is safe. You have to have control of the centre, or the centre has to be closed in order for an attack on the flanks to be successful. He says that as long as the opponent has a chance of breaking through in the centre, an offensive manoeuvre on the flank is usually a mistake. And Paulsen continues with a6. This a6 move is to free up the rook, because if the rook was to move now, it would just hang this a7 pawn. So he plays a6, and we see that Reti comments about how one of the more unfortunate parts about Black's position is that he can't get this bishop into play by bringing it to g7, because as soon as black plays g6, if you try it now, as soon as he plays g6, Anderssen can respond with knight f6 check, and then after king h8 there will be a whole load of discovered checks and combinations that are at Anderssen's disposal here. And this is one of the reasons why Paulsen wants to get this rook into play, because he wants to bring the rook to e6 so he can help defend this f6 square. So after g6, if the knight jumps into f6, Paulsen can just snap it off with the rook. Anderssen continues with g4. This continues with the general attack on the king, but there's also a preventative measure, making this rook e6 maneuver a little bit pointless, because if Anderssen gets a pawn onto g5, then after g6 and a knight f6, the knight will be protected by this pawn. But nevertheless, Paulsen continues, rook e8, and justified move, it controls the open file, f4, and then rook e6. So even though Anderssen could play g5, he still plays rook e6 and g5. And Reti writes a bit about this position. He says that black's plan at stopping knight f6 is defeated, and he says that Paulsen got criticised a bit for this rook e6 move, because Anderssen could simply make this move pointless by playing g5. But Reti says that he thinks the criticism levelled at this rook e6 move is perhaps a bit unjustified. Paulsen had commented that he played rook e6 to provoke g5, because he didn't want white to exchange on f5. He didn't want white to have this open g-file towards his king. I think he believed that Anderssen playing g5, cementing his option of knight f6, perhaps was the lesser of two evils. And so Paulsen continues with b5, and with this move, black is hoping to get some counterplay on the queen side, although he can't really do anything that effective anywhere on the board. h4, rook e8, then queen d3, and Anderssen conducts his attack quite subtly, but still unrelentingly. He prepares playing h5, because then after the queen takes it off, Anderssen can simply take on f5 instead. Rook b8, h5, and now a5. And Anderssen responds with b4, stopping black's maneuver right at the exact right moment. Black's pawn on b5 is going to permanently obstruct this light square bishop, and the rook on b8 is just staring at a pawn. So we have a takes b6, a takes b4, a takes b4, queen takes h5, and queen takes f5. And it's worth noting, black probably took on h5 to try and prevent white's pawn from getting too powerful, because in this position, white was probably threatening something like queen g1, rook g1, queen f3, possibly g6 as well. And another threat might well have been h6, and black can't play g6 because of the potential of knight f6 check, followed by queen d4, x-raying the king. So queen takes h5, queen takes f5, then queen f7, offering a queen trade. We see this all the time, just trying to exchange off your opponent's queen when the opponent's is attacking, exchanging off your opponent's best attacking piece. Of course, Anderssen doesn't want to exchange off his best attacking piece. It would only benefit Paulsen. So queen d3, bishop d7, hoping to get the bishop back in the game. Unfortunately, this does, however, free up the c3 knight. Whilst the bishop was here, this knight was forced to defend the knight on d5, but now this knight can move freely, and we see Anderssen jump at this opportunity. Knight e4. Queen f5. And now rook h1. And Reti comments, this is the last comment of the game, about how Anderssen conducts his attack with a wonderful precision. He now threatens knight to e3, followed by queen g6 and then f5. If we give black a bit of a nothing move, rook a8, knight e3, queen g6 and f5. And here, if Paulsen takes the bishop, then he just loses the piece, because they can't take back because of the potential check. Interestingly enough, at this position, the computer finds queen f7 as a potential draw later on down the line. But what can we say? Paulsen's human. He's not going to find obscure moves like this. Rook h1. So we have rook h1 and then rook e8. So with rook h1, Anderssen was threatening the knight e3 move. Paulsen responds rook e8, and now Anderssen pulls off a combination which gets him into a winning position and wins the game. We have knight f6 check, g takes f6, knight takes f6 check, king f7, rook takes h7, bishop g7, rook takes g7, king takes g7, and knight takes e8. And it's worth noting you can't take this knight because you'll lose the queen. So king f8, queen takes f5, bishop takes f5, and knight takes d6. And here Paulsen resigned. Anderssen's quite clearly got a easily winning endgame. He's got 4 pawns to 1, and 2 of them are protected pass pawns. This pawn is under attack and will be quite easily exchanged off. Anderssen's going to be quite easily going to get 3 pass pawns. 2 of them are protected. There's no way Paulsen can win this, and so he resigned. And that's it for the Anderssen games. The next person in the book is Paul Morphy, which I'm quite excited for. He's a legend. You don't really get much better than analysing the games of Paul Morphy. And so with that, I hope to see you during the next video then. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, please like, comment and subscribe. If you want to see anything, please just drop a comment, or I'll try and read as many comments as I can. Any feedback is always appreciated.